Welcome back, everyone. We're going to get back underway now with our first panel session of the day. This is the consumers' experiences in the current energy market, or in current energy markets, plural, I should say. And it's chaired by Dr. Shanthi Robertson, who's the Associate Director of the Insight Centre. And I'm just going to put it out there, a massive policy head. So good luck.
Okay, good morning and welcome to our first panel session for the 2023 Foresighting Forum. I'm Shanthi, I'll be your chair for this 90-minute discussion. And yes, I am a bit of a policy head and also a sociologist by training and a qualitative research specialist, so I'm really, really excited about some of the lived experience dimensions of the energy consumer experience that we'll be talking about today. So the focus of this first panel is consumers' current experiences in the existing energy market. And I think this panel really lays the groundwork and opens up the thinking to go really productively into a focus on consumer expectations of the future in the panel after lunch, and also for a visit, of course, to the Digital Energy Futures room next door, which I'll be getting to directly after. We've got a really fantastic lineup of speakers for this morning's panel. They're coming at this focus on the current consumer experience from a number of different angles, and I think this panel is also the perfect opportunity to really rise and open up to the challenge that Lynn set us this morning, to really hear and listen to some very diverse consumer perspectives. But I just want to open by framing in a bit more detail the focus of the panel. We're centering this morning how consumers are faring now in the energy market and where they might need more help. Our speakers are going to delve into the experiences of some specific types of consumers, covering renters, First Nation communities and business consumers, who of course have very different experiences in the market and face different barriers. So they'll be sparking some thinking on how our solutions really do need to be tailored to the different needs and challenges that these groups face. And I think overall will invite us to maintain that reflection on the diversity of consumer experience across our 2 days of discussion at the forum. But I just wanted to touch before we start on a couple of very high-level insights about how consumers are feeling about the energy market right now. And I'm going to draw here on some of ECA's most recent research, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. So looking at the most recent release of ECA's Energy Consumer Sentiment Survey in December 22, this is the most comprehensive ongoing research study into the attitudes and activities of both residential and small business energy consumers in Australia. And I think one of the really key things that stood out for me in that recent release was that downturn in consumer confidence. So people's belief that the energy market is working in the long-term interests of consumers really dropped. Positive ratings have gone down there from 44% in June 2022 to 35% in December. And I think that's probably as expected, as you all know, the kind of crisis context of that particular 6-month time period. But I am a qualitative specialist at heart, so I was also really interested in the qualitative sentiment work that ECA has done, which gives a bit of a sense of the why behind that downturn. And I think also reflects some of the things that came up in Paul's keynote address earlier this morning. So there are 3 key findings of ECA's qualitative sentiment work. 1, recent bill increases, the expectation of further rises, have really convinced consumers that there are deep underlying problems with the energy system. And they really see this as a whole of supply chain issue. So it's not just about retailers or government from the consumer perspective. They are thinking in a systems way about the issues. Second, consumers lack trust in energy providers and governments to put consumers' best interests at the forefront. And 3, consumers are very supportive of the transition to renewables, but there are of course those existing concerns about reliability issues and cost. So Lynn really talked about a thriving system, and I think these insights point to a number of the problems that we need to solve to get there. But I think it's also worth pointing out in that qualitative research that consumers also acknowledge the complexity and the scale of the challenge that is facing government and regulators in energy. They really acknowledge there's no silver bullet fix, and this is something that we're going to all work on together. So I think that's kind of an optimistic note there in terms of that very top line summary of current consumer sentiment towards the system. There's a lot more to delve into, obviously, with the ECA sentiment insights, but also now from some much more in-depth perspectives from our panel. So that really was just a starting point. I'm now going to invite our panel each to speak in turn for about 5 to 7 minutes. We'll have a bit of discussion amongst the panellists, and then I'll open up to questions from all of you, which, as you know, you can pop directly into Slido. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for the panel, Cathy Standen. Cathy is the Executive General Manager of Consumer Policy and Markets at the Australian Energy Regulator. The AER regulates wholesale and retail energy markets and networks under the national energy legislation rules, mostly for our eastern and southern Australian markets. Cathy has overseen the AER's focus on positive consumer outcomes through projects such as the Consumer Vulnerability Strategy and the Better Bills Guideline. I think Cathy is really ideally placed to open our discussion this morning with a whole of market picture about what the AER is seeing in terms of consumer experience, but also some insights gleaned from their incredible consumer-focused initiatives on equity and vulnerability. Welcome, Cathy.
Thanks, Shanthy, and thank you very much for having me today. I have to apologise, I'm at that age where I need glasses to read, but I cannot see any faces. So when I'm looking at you strangely, I think, oh, I know you, but I can't place where I know you. So it's a great opportunity for the AER and me in particular to participate in today's forum. Particularly in this time of change, enormous change in the energy market and the undergoing major technological, structural, regulatory and should I say political change too in the market. But no part of the energy sector is actually immune from these changes, all of which require careful navigation to ensure that the market delivers the best possible outcomes for consumers. Right now, we think that the most pressing risk facing consumers is affordability. Many of the risk factors that contributed to the 2022 prices remain. International coal prices and gas remain high and volatile, with potential impact on domestic prices. Rising retail prices in response to the sharp increases in wholesale costs and forward contract prices are putting a real strain on retail prices. These increases will eventually flow through to customers in the form of wholesale costs and the network component of bills. But not only are costs actually an impediment for the market, consumers in the market at the moment, but also complexity. And I know that we'll talk about complexity today in the panel discussion. But at the AER, we take about 500 calls a day, a month, should I say? 500 calls a day, that'd be unbelievable. I'd be working for an ombudsman if I was getting 500 calls a day. No, 500 calls a month. And the majority of the people are actually ringing up to seek advice how to actually access the market and not understand how it works. And so our job, I think, in some ways is to help that facilitation occurs. But how is price and complexity impacting consumers? So last year, the AER staff provided advice to Melbourne researchers at the Melbourne Institute on survey questions to understand the impact on energy prices on consumers. The latest round of the Melbourne Institute's Taking Pulse of the Nation survey was conducted in December and included questions on energy poverty, underconsumption and other strategies and behaviours consumers are using to try to pay for their energy. It's a national survey and it was based on about 1,000 responses. Respondents are deemed to be in financial stress if they report feeling moderately or very financially stressed in terms of paying for essential goods and services such as bills, rents, mortgages. So the key findings we found very interesting. 1 in 5 Australians can't afford to heat or cool their homes to an affordable or comfortable level, should I say. The proportion is 5 times higher for those in financial stress compared to others. About half of those in financial stress are trying to reduce their energy bills by using less heating, cooling, hot water and cooking and electrical appliances. 12% overall and 35% of those in financial stress are skipping meals or eating less to pay their electricity bill. So the AER, who are we and what we do and what do we need to do to respond to this? So the AER, in a strange roundabout way, exists so that consumers are better off now and in the future. Yes, we are a government department in a roundabout way. We are accountable to energy ministers. But our boards see our role as primarily to ensure that consumers are better off each and every day. We focus on ensuring a secure, reliable and affordable energy future for Australia as we transition to a carbon economy. I thought it might be useful for me just to consider how AER are actually working to ensure that consumers are better off now and I'll give you some examples, but also considering about what kind of regulatory frameworks that we might need in the future so that consumers are actually better off as well. I'd like to start with the DMO, the default market offer. And I was telling Rick this story before where one of my senior staff come into my office on Tuesday morning, so excited she could hardly speak. And she said, guess what? And I said, what? And she said, in Rick's email this week, the DMO was mentioned. Can you believe a piece of work that we do each and every day was mentioned in Rick's email? And I went, who's Rick? Now I know who Rick is. So each year the default market offer is for small business and residential customers are set by the AER in both South Australia, South Australia, New South Wales and also South East Queensland where I live. It is designed to provide a safety net to protect consumers from unjustifiably high prices. While we anticipate higher wholesale price increases and additional network prices, forward contract prices for 2023-24 have decreased around 50% on average since the October federal budget. Early indications suggest that we might be having a slightly better outlook in 2023 than we originally thought, probably around October last year. We are examining all elements of the DMO, what we call this cost stack, and consulting with consumers and retailers about what that would look like. We're looking into whether the setting of the retail allowance and the wholesale costs remain appropriate given the prevailing market conditions. We expect that we will be publishing the electricity price for those jurisdictions in the week commencing the 13th of May, which obviously many people in this room will be interested to see the outcome of. One of the major projects that we talked about, that Shranthi mentioned at the beginning, is our Towards Energy Equity strategy, which is our vulnerability strategy for consumers in the national energy market. As we can see from increasing the energy prices, the costs of vulnerability are large and likely to grow. Our Towards Energy Equity strategy aims to provide a sector-wide approach to improving affordability and helping those experiencing vulnerability to get the best out of the market. In developing Towards Energy Equity strategy, we undertook a lot of consultation and lived experience research, and I do appreciate those people who contributed to that research over the last couple of years. All this work highlighted the need for systemic reform to drive better outcomes for consumers. That's why the strategy includes what we call a game changer action. So we've brought a group of stakeholders together from across the sector to develop what we think could be game changers using human-centred design process. As part of this process, some of the ideas will be tested with consumers who have lived experiences of vulnerability as well. Further, at the moment, my colleague Janine Rayner, who's sitting over at the front table here, is developing a consumer strategy for the AER. We're in our early phases of embedding a consumer strategy, which will focus on making consumers a part of what we do each and every day. This will support embedding insights into the work that we undertake and the decisions in particular that we make. Considering the consumer experience as a whole of sector approach, using tools as customer journey mapping will aim to remove perverse outcomes from intersecting policies and regulatory reforms. The other part of it that I wanted to mention today is how we ensure consumers are better off in the future, not just now. And that really comes to the idea around how we need to kind of keep up with evolving regulation, or how a regulation needs to change up with an evolving sector. We're undertaking a significant review of consumer protections for future energy services right now. So ensuring the current framework maybe remains fit for purpose where necessary, but identifying and updating it so that consumers are adequately protected from emerging risks. Last year, we consulted with stakeholders to examine 3 types of potential future work frameworks. So thinking about what's in scope, such as the impact of the flow of electricity in and out of homes, and out of scope, such as assets like solar panels and EVs and pool pumps. But our consultation to date highlights the different perspectives of retailers, innovators and consumers. Retailers want a framework that can be competitively neutral and prefer a future framework that closely connects to the NECF that exists now, but with clear obligations. Innovators are concerned with regulating emerging markets, such as EV charging, and support a framework that is flexible and will encourage consumer and also investor confidence. Consumer advocates, on the other hand, have told us that they are keen to see a flexible framework, given the emerging technologies, that still enables consumers to easily understand their rights, such as dispute resolution, and go beyond regulating supplier conduct to actively considering good outcomes rather than what goes in the front end. We have a balancing role to undertake, obviously, to kind of make sure that those regulatory settings will provide an adequate return on investment, but at least cost with the most benefit for consumers. The AER board will consider these options and hopefully by the end of February come forward to provide some advice as to which way we'd like to go. I'd just like to say in closing that consumers need to feel confident in the Australian transition because we need to make sure that the market is working for them. We do welcome your views on how to help shape what is ultimately in the interests of providing a secure, reliable, fit-for-purpose network at the least cost, and I think that's important for the consumer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. We'll move straight on to our second speaker, Joel. Joel Dignam is the Executive Director of Better Renting, a community of renters working together for stable, affordable and healthy homes. Joel has worked extensively on minimum energy efficiency standards for rental homes, as well as collaborating on establishing the Healthy Homes for Renters Coalition. So Joel's going to be focusing today on some issues facing renters as energy consumers, including challenging the way we might think about split incentives framing and about what consumers really need to understand about energy efficiency. Welcome, Joel.
Good morning, everyone. As I start, I'd like to echo Lynn's comments earlier today. As we look towards World Pride starting soon in Sydney, I think we really should lift up our gaze, and also the other members of the LGBTIQ community. Thanks, Rick. So I'm Joel from Better Renting. We're a community of renters working together for stable, affordable and healthy homes. We're pretty big on the topic of minimum energy efficiency standards for rental homes. I'm not going to give a glib treatment of that this morning. I'm sort of assuming we roughly get the contours of this issue, that rental properties tend to be less efficient, that people in them thus spend more on energy or have colder homes. This is pretty bad for your cost of living. It's pretty bad for your health. What I want to do instead is maybe give some new angles for sort of thinking about some of these issues. So one I want to speak about is the motivation structure of landlords. I want to speak a bit about what the responsibility is of customers in this system. And thirdly, I'm interested in reflecting on the role of air conditioning, particularly as we go forward. So let's talk about the landlords first. So many of us would have seen the recent consultation paper about the National Energy Performance Strategy, which had this sort of glib reference to split incentives. It's pretty common, this idea that rental properties are inefficient because landlords pay the cost of improving them, but they don't yield the benefits. This is the split incentives idea. I think it's a pretty lacking model for understanding what's going on, and a good model tends to accurately predict behaviour, but that's not what we see here. Because if the split incentive model were true, people who own their own properties would tend to invest more in energy efficiency than they do. Their incentives are actually aligned, but they don't really get around energy efficiency as much as I'd like to see. And even when you give landlords incentives to invest, sometimes big subsidies, sometimes free things, here, have the air conditioner, they still underinvest in energy efficiency. So what's really going on here? I think a better way of thinking about this is maybe yielding some insights from behavioural economics and thinking about this as an issue of status quo bias. The status quo is really nice when you're not living in the property. You don't have to think about it. It doesn't cost you anything. I'm talking for the landlord, I mean here. They're just chilling out. And in contrast, investing in energy efficiency entails risk, it entails effort, there's a cognitive overhead. And so I think this is a much better model for understanding what's going on for the owners of rental properties. I think it lines up a lot better with what we've seen and what with other people rolling out programs in this space have seen. I think it points us in a different direction for how we try to solve this issue, and certainly it suggests that carrots alone won't be enough on that. So feel free to any of these. I'm hoping to prompt some questions later. We can come back to that one. Secondly, I want to talk about an energy system that works for all. And I think in a group like this, we're all pretty tuned in to how these things work. Probably the people we associate with are too. But I think we really need to challenge ourselves to think about that person who doesn't know their NIMI from their NEM. I'm going to nickname them Angus. And we need to think about this person and recognise that they still need to be getting a good deal out of this energy system. I think what we heard a bit earlier today about that focus on outcome, maybe rather than sort of the energy inputs, is part of this thinking. But I really want us to think about that person who isn't going to shop around for that retailer, who doesn't know what a kilowatt hour is, who is basically passive in the system. How does the system meet the needs of that passive person without them having to engage agentically with it? It should just work. And I think probably the nearest analogue I can come up here is the water system, maybe. Most of the time I turn on the water, I have enough water in my home, I'm not worried about the cost of water. I don't even need to really connect the water when I move into my place. It's just water. It's there. It's when I need it. Maybe energy could be a bit more like that. Finally, I want to speak about air conditioning. I really love air conditioning because of its potential to reduce mortality from heat waves. It is really effective at that, and we're going to have more heat waves in the future. More people are going to die, but fewer people are going to die if they have access to air conditioning. But there are some problems here. Plenty of people do not currently have access to air conditioning. Plenty of renters we work with who have air conditioning in their properties still cannot actually, even when they're using it, get their property down to a livable temperature. And of course, some people who have it won't use it because of their concerns about the cost. There's also, I think, some real important considerations around the sort of justice dimensions of this. Households that don't have air conditioning cross-subsidise those who do. We all cross-subsidise them through the climate pollution associated with air conditioning on our current grid. And there's also the waste heat being pumped out of people's compressors, maybe from the apartment next door. So there's, I think, some real concerns around maximising the benefits of air conditioning for all people, maybe those who don't get it these days, while avoiding maladaptation. To be a bit more prescriptive on this, I really think that does have to involve looking at passive energy efficiency measures, not just within households, but at the level of our communities and our suburbs, what we can do on our streetscape as well as measures that maybe aren't passive, but are like really great at a really low cost, like ceiling fans. I've already made my pun for today, so I won't do the obvious one there. And when I think also making sure that people don't have to worry about the cost of running cooling appliances on a hot day. This, I think, really makes sure that the energy they're getting from the grid is cleaner and it's cheaper, and wherever possible, they can be accessing their own locally generated energy, which is really a bit of a challenge for renters at the moment, but one that's really worth thinking about and can really help to save some lives. So I'm all for that. Great. Well, I've spoken pretty quickly. Good on me. I'll reiterate the 3 points, though. Maybe there were more important points I missed, but no, I think we've got my main idea there. So this idea of bounded rationality is something I want us to think about, that landlords, they're not homo economicus. If we want them to go and make better decisions for renters, it's going to take a little bit more than trying to think about this just as a split incentives problem. Secondly, we need to think about the Anguses of the world, people who have no understanding of the energy system, who've maybe been promoted beyond their capabilities in that regard. How we can get an energy system that is going to meet the needs of that person without requiring too much from them. And finally, let's think about how we do create an energy system that can sustain health in a hotter future, that will give people access to the energy they need without externalising the costs of that. Thank you.
Poor Angus.
Poor old Angus. Oh, thanks. All right, thank you so much, Joel. I'd now like to welcome our third speaker, Ruby Hurd from the First Nations Clean Energy Network. Ruby is a descendant of the Jaru people of the Eastern Kimberley region of Western Australia. She is an electrical engineer and runs Alinga Energy Consulting. Alinga provides renewable energy and microgrid consulting services with a focus on remote and off-grid applications. So today Ruby's going to be sharing with us a summary of learnings from her research and engagement with energy users in remote communities, including around affordability and payments, relationships with providers, and consumer energy usage and knowledge. So I think Ruby's providing us with a really critical opportunity to think beyond the urban and suburban consumers. And I just had a chat to Ruby in the morning tea, and I'd also like to note that due to a number of airline snafus, it took Ruby 13 hours to get down to Sydney from Rockhampton. So she deserves a round of applause on that alone. Welcome, Ruby.
Thanks very much. Yes, I'm very tired, but I'll try to bring some energy to this. I am an electrical engineer, so I do know what a kilowatt hour is. So you can come and ask me, Rick, if you'd like a short lesson. Okay, so thanks, Shanti, and good morning, everyone. So as part of some feasibility studies that I've been working on with federal government funding, I recently interviewed 22 community members about their energy usage and perspectives. So just to set the scene of these communities, these comments are from two communities that are located more than 6 hours drive east of Broome. The community power comes from 3 diesel generators in each community, and they're located less than 200 metres from some of the homes. So people smell them, people hear them, it's a constant thing in their lives. They burn up to 1,000 litres of diesel per day to supply just 40 homes. All the homes have prepaid meters, and that means that they have to top them up with credit by purchasing a little physical plastic card from their local store. And it's the one store in town, and it's closed for most of the weekend. So they get no information about their power usage from these meters other than just seeing a little balance of how much money they have remaining. And that also means that we don't have any data out of these meters either. So they don't get any data, and we don't get any data that we can analyse and use to look at their energy usage or improve how the community is working with those diesel generators. And so what happens is when that credit ticks down, their meter disconnects. And they have to go back outside and reload a new power card onto the meter. Okay, so on affordability and payments. 2 customers told me that when they run out of power on the weekend, after their emergency $3 credit is used, their power disconnects. And this is actually against the regulatory codes that require that people be connected until Monday morning when they can go to the shop and purchase another card. So we clearly have a problem there where the meters are not lining up with the regulations. So what do people do when they run out of power and the shop's not open? People told me that they sleep at their parents' house instead. They have their whole family and children camp outside. They door knock and ask their neighbours and family for spare power cards. And a neighbour might offer an extension cord to them out of their window so that they can plug in their air conditioner still. When I asked about the cost of energy, I got mixed responses. 50% of people said it was okay or all right or right. 36% thought it was too high. 1 person thought it was cheap. And 2 people couldn't give me an answer, one saying that she didn't know how much she was paying really. So that was a pretty common sentiment. Some people said they wished their meter told them how many days of power they had left rather than how much money, because that would be more useful to them. Because obviously without the historical records, it's very hard for them to figure out how much they're using on a daily or weekly basis. They have people coming in and out of the house, family and that sort of things all the time. So it's quite hard. When I asked if they thought they paid more or less or about the same as people in other places like Fitzroy Crossing, Broome, Perth, 40% of people struggled to give me an answer at all because they just couldn't fathom what other people might be paying. They just said they don't know, and they didn't really know how much they were using either. So it was pretty hard for them to answer that. So then coming back to the question about affordability, it now means a lot less that 50% of people thought the cost was all right because they have nothing to compare it to. On the electricity provider relationship, these communities, these 2 that I'm working with, are supplied by the state government's Department of Communities. But when I asked people who supplied their energy, 30% said they did not know, and 70% answered that it was either the maintenance provider, KRSP, Horizon Power, or M-Light, which is the company that makes the cards, so it's printed on their power cards. So no one knew where their power really came from or who they were paying. The communities are about to experience a shift in their energy delivery as Horizon Power is going to actually come in and take over as the new supplier. No one in the community is aware that this will be happening or that they'll need to be moved off their low government tariffs of 17 cents per kilowatt hour to the state mandated tariff of 30 cents per kilowatt hour at some point. And Horizon don't actually know how they're going to manage this transition. So of the people who knew who Horizon Power were, they were generally positive about the prospect of moving to Horizon Power. So particularly the idea of getting an app and being able to pay for power online and to see their usage. Several people also mentioned that it would be better to not have the power cards as it would cut down on rubbish. So these cards are single use, and there's 3,800 cards sold per year in just one of those communities. So there's a lot of plastic waste going on as well that we can avoid. So using the Horizon Power app requires having a smartphone, good service, phone credit, a key card for payments, and a certain level of literacy, numeracy, and technology skills, which not everyone in these communities has. So that could be a barrier to people accessing the information and features when it comes in. When I asked people about ways that they could reduce their electricity spend and usage, over half of the participants responded that they could just turn things completely off. 3 people said that they could cook outside on a fire or use a portable gas stove. 2 people said that they could sleep outside where it's a bit cooler. One said he could turn all the lights off in the house and use the lights spilling in from the neighbour's house. And that was inventive. And one said that they could cut down on buying food, as we've heard previously. So energy efficiency measures of adding house insulation and upgrading light globes were mentioned only once, and 7 people had absolutely no ideas for me on how they could control their energy usage and spend. One lady told me that there had been an upgrade to LEDs, but she didn't know why, and she suggested that it might have had something to do with the bugs that gathered around the lights. So, that speaks to the level of education there about energy efficiency. And I also discovered that the Energy Star ratings on appliances were not understood by people either. When I asked people about renewable energy, like solar power and wind turbines, the term renewable energy didn't mean anything to anyone. So we have to think about that when we're using this language that means something to the rest of us, but may not mean anything to the consumers we're talking to. Over 80% of people were familiar with solar panels and wind turbines though. However, 9 people did not know of any benefits of using them. Only 4 participants mentioned environmental benefits, but 8 participants were confident that it was cheaper than diesel, and 2 called it free energy. So just to summarise those key insights, we've got this outdated prepaid metering systems that are putting stress on families and causing them to alter their lives in a way that we would never ask people in cities and towns to do. Energy literacy is incredibly low, and people want to be educated to help them control their power costs. These people are not informed. They don't know who they are even buying their electricity from, and they don't know how much they are spending, which is very disempowering. And people know solar power would offer cheaper energy, but they don't have access to it, usually because the restrictions with integrating with prepaid meters, it's not something that is available to them at the moment. And they also don't own their homes, so they have similar restrictions to the rental market. So there's definitely way more to go into in this space, but I'll have to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruby. Rounding out our panel this morning, we have our final speaker, David Harding, who is the Executive Director at Business New South Wales. Business New South Wales focuses on the wellbeing and sustainable growth of the business community. But David is one of these people that wears a lot of hats. So as well as his leadership at Business New South Wales, he's co-chair of the Committee for Sydney Commission into the Future of the Sydney CBD, an advisory councillor to Smart New South Wales, and he also represents consumer interests at the AER. So David's going to share findings from Business New South Wales' recent research looking at the next generation of energy support and what's really needed to give businesses the confidence to engage and invest and to build resilience in the current operating environment. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always fun to come last, isn't it, on such a panel as erudite as this. But thank you very much for everyone who's here. Thank you for being here. I'm very pleased to be amongst customers of ours and clients of ours, collaborators of ours, and all of us, of course, consumer energy tragics. So it's a real honour to be here and speak to you. Business New South Wales, just to round that out, we actually represent 100,000 members across New South Wales and more broadly Australia in the business sector. And that means within our membership base, we've got everyone from major generators, distributors, retailers, and all the way down to poor old Angus, who's running a business in his rental property. So we have the whole gamut to draw on, and we do draw on it very widely. In fact, I stand here today having just finished a survey of 1,200 members yesterday on rising costs. A couple of weeks ago, we did a pre-election survey of 900 businesses, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And of course, the ECA and Business New South Wales have collaborated very recently also on the report that you can see copies of around this building today. And I will not read all of that because I'll never get through it in 5 minutes. But I'll draw out a couple of the learnings from that, which are very, very pertinent to business, small business. And we'll draw on some of the threads that we've already heard from the panel today. The threads of a lack of education and understanding are absolutely common in business as they are in the broader community, because remember, businesses are of the community and community is of business. Business people are people who live in the community, who interact with the community and share the same pains of rising prices and the like. But look, I wanted to really, I suppose, to frame a few words today in the fact that Australia faces the biggest change management project of its history. We are, in the middle of course, the fourth technological revolution, and the supply of affordable, reliable, and indeed sovereign energy to our communities, to those most at risk, all the way up to those businesses on whom we rely for our communities, our wages, and shoes for our children, etc. It's such an important project. It's all-encompassing. It's absolutely huge. And I guess what we're seeing in our surveys as a really high-level thing is that we're missing that thing that a project needs. It's called a project plan. We hear about roadmaps. We hear about plans. We hear about pathways to the future. We even hear about milestones, and there are plenty of them kicking around at the moment. We've got 2030, we've got 2035, we've got 2050, and so on as milestones. But what are the bits underneath that provide a project plan that people can buy into, that people can understand, that people can see what the determining factors need to be before those milestones are reached, and how we play into it? I'd say that a lot of the people talking about roadmaps and so on at the moment would make very poor project managers. And I say that with deep love in my heart. The second point, I suppose, is around having the team on board. Any project manager will tell you that if you're to deliver a project on time and to budget and to the satisfaction of the client, you need to have an engaged team. You need to have a trained team. You need to have a team that's excited about being on that project and sees those milestones as personal goals, as well as goals which benefit the project overall. And I guess that talks to this thing about engagement, about training, about bringing people along the journey, common language, common playbooks. We've just come out of COVID. Business and politics and the community work together in an incredibly tight timescale. There are some people in this room, I'm seeing Alexi down there, who work with me day and night on behalf of the business community to ensure that the business community came along and we moved as smoothly as possible through COVID. This, to me, seems like a very similar challenge to us at the moment, that we need to bring government, the politicians, the bureaucrats, with business, large, medium and small, and the community around that common understanding, a common understanding of terminology and what we need to perhaps give before we get in this very, very tough transition that we have in front of us. And the last one is around, I think being back on the project, is around how do we engage our subcontractors and our clients and so on to be able to engage in the project quite easily. We over the wonderful history of our Commonwealth of Australia, have layered complexity and complexity over the generation, transmission, distribution, retail, and so on of energy. And in this great change that we have to simplify that. We absolutely have to make it clear, streamlined, as to how new entry, new product, or indeed new products with older players can play into this, because otherwise we really are not looking at it as a change project anymore. We're looking at it as basically something that's business as usual, only a bit bigger, and I think we all know that's not what we're looking at the moment. But back to our members, so 900 of them responded a few days ago to a survey before the New South Wales election. It was particularly about what issues do you want us to take to the New South Wales election on March the 25th of this year. 702 of them actually wrote back. So it was a Qualtrics survey, you could click on your phone, but 702 of them were so worked up about this that they wrote back. Many of them using words which I can't possibly use in such a forum here. And they talked about the costs rising, of course, due to the RBA's constant raising of interest rates. They talked about insurance costs. They talked about inequitable taxes like payroll, but far and away the leader out front there, and not a Bradbury kind of leader, it was a really strong leader, was energy prices. Businesses are really worried about energy because they lack the understanding. They don't know where the light is at the end of the tunnel. Nay, they don't even know what the tunnel is that they're looking at the moment. They don't understand the journey they're on. And if you can kind of take one thing away from our view of the marketplace at the moment, is that there is a deep despair. They look at the UK, they look at Europe, and they say, is that what's coming to us? We don't have nuclear. I'm not saying we should, but look at the UK. They've got wind aplenty, they've got gas aplenty, they've got nuclear, and they're still down the Swanee at the moment. And we need to be able to put them on that roadmap and perhaps even put out there the challenges very clearly on the roadmap that businesses are going to have to walk past, work past, and work into. They need to take their own responsibility for their own futures, but they need to do it in a way that they understand. They need to understand that playbook, they need to understand that glossary of terms, and they need to understand when it's going to get hardest for them to invest and when it's going to start getting easier again. Certainty is not there, it's in fact the very opposite. So we're calling for education more than anything else at the moment. We're saying the government needs to step in, work with energy retailers, work with business associations like my own, and work with the bigger players in industry to be able to spell out that roadmap, spell out the terminology, and tell people in business and community how they will play that game. And last, and I'll end on this because we need to get to the questions, the last thing here is around the ease of doing business in Australia in the energy space. I think it's high time that we need to look at the fractured and overlapping regulatory systems that we have at the moment. They may have been very sensible in the build-up over the years when we had a relatively stable energy transmission generation retail market. That's all getting blown up now. I think we all know that. We need to look at things very differently, and I think we need to pull things into a much more streamlined and easy way. I congratulate the AER on their sandbox initiative to make it easier for new products to be trialled in the Australian market, and I'd like to see an awful lot more of that, and so would our members. But yeah, so it's a big project. We need a plan. We need to be educated. We need all the team to be on board with us, and we need to make it easy for those bigger players to come in and work with us on that project. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to all our speakers, especially for keeping so perfectly to time. It's far easier to chair industry and advocacy folks than it is academics, I have to say, in terms of timekeeping. Again, with all respect to my academic colleagues in the room. So I just want to note before we jump into the discussion for the audience that we do have links to the various reports and initiatives from our speaker organisations available through the Forum app. So that includes the AER Energy Equity Guidelines, a video from Ruby with some further information about the First Nations Clean Energy Network, Business New South Wales research report, Unfinished Business, and Better Renting's report, Cold and Costly. They're all very much worth a look, I think, having gone through them all this week. There's a lot of really good insights and valuable resources there. Before we open to the audience, we're just going to have a bit of a dialogue between the panellists. So I'll start by inviting our panel to ask a question of each other, if they've got one. Joel?
Yeah.
Joel was writing notes, I saw him.
Very diligent. I'm like, oh my goodness, I get my pen out.
I have a question for Ruby. I feel like there was a potential tension between what we were saying. Because I was sort of saying, I want a system where the customer's like passive and they just get a good outcome delivered to them on a plate. But then you described a community that was sort of passive in the energy system, who just had outcomes being delivered to them that were really bad for them. So I'm wondering, like, what does the answer look like for this community? Is it more of an agentic model, or is it still a level of passivity, but actually the outcome is a better one, and how do we get there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and we haven't really tried the alternative. So they've only been given the passive option. So maybe the answer is just to trial something, to work through with community, to create something that is community-led, and we let them drive what kind of input they want to have. But right now they're at the farthest end of the scale of being passive and not, you're talking about people having confusing bills. These people don't even get bills. They have no record of how much they've spent on power at all. They definitely don't know what a kilowatt hour is. They don't even have that choice though. Their meter just has a dollar value. So they don't even get presented with that level of basic information. So I think it's something that we need to feel out and work through, but the answer is not to just assume that everybody wants no information. To me, that also leads to to things happening behind the scenes, potential for corruption, all that sort of thing. They only have the option of having the one provider as well, like we do in Northern Queensland too. I think that it's definitely not that level of passiveness that we're looking for everyone. Where we land, I don't know, but 2 weeks ago there was a conference here, academic energy conference, and we talked about just giving people the choice. You should be able to participate and get the information to whatever level that you want, and we'll just have people all across that spectrum.
Thanks, Ruby. David, did you have a question from the panellists?
Yeah, I've got some notes here, and it says if I'm feeling provocative, I should ask the AER a question, and I am, so I will. And thanks, Simon, for the question. It says, if you had one special power that you don't have at the moment, what would that be to improve the outcomes for energy consumers in the massive change that we're in at the moment? What's your special power that you need?
For communication between all of the sectors, for people to listen and actually understand what people are saying to each other. I know that sounds really basic, but I think that's one of the fundamental problems that we have. We have people that work one direction, we have people working in another direction, but no one really communicates and listens to each other to understand fundamentally what we're all trying to achieve. And I know there's comments, I think, in some of the questions around, that they are diametrically opposite, retailers and consumers. I don't believe that. I don't believe at the end of the day the retailer wants to rip off the consumer by any stretch of the imagination. They want an ongoing customer that can, support through giving electricity to. But I think that there's a communication breakdown between all sectors, whether that's the distribution networks, whether it's retailers, whether it's wholesalers, whether it's consumers, and we just don't listen to each other. So it's a very basic question. It's not like some sort of new regulatory tool that I want, but I want to be able to make sure that people
From the outside in, many regulators, if I may say.
Many regulators.
From the outside in, many regulators.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's taken us as the AER, we're a regulator, to talk about the word consumer. Do you know what I mean? Following on from our siblings, the ACCC, who have really started thinking about what consumer outcomes look like. And for us, it's a real challenge for us to kind of turn around about being an old school regulator full of economists about how much we need to make sure that people, how much spending happens and what all the economics behind it all. But we're now talking about people, and so consumers have to be at the heart of the decisions that we make as an organisation.
Thank you.
Ruby, what about you? Do you have a provocative question?
I don't think so, but I'll just throw something back at Joel there. So you talked about the fact that maybe it's not an economic problem for landlords not investing in their tenants' homes. So are you working on some kind of program to then take some of that, what did you call it, cognitive load? I like that. Because there is a lot of research involved when you're trying to decide to do any kind of energy efficiency upgrades or get solar, equipment and suppliers and all that sort of stuff. So I work with a program in Victoria that's a solar homes program, where they take that away from just the consumer and they say, we've picked a good installer, we've got the equipment, you don't need to think about it, and it's also going to be subsidised by council. So are you working on any programs that might take some of that guesswork away and that research need away from them?
Great, thank you, Ruby. So the program we're most enthusiastic about is make it mandatory for landlords to bring their properties up to a minimum standard of energy efficiency. Which sort of takes away the cognitive load of, do I need to do this? Because yes, you do. But I think that program does work a lot better where the government is hand in hand with the property investor to make it as easy as possible for them to comply. And as I said, owner-occupiers also struggle with this. It is difficult. It's often language people don't understand. What is an R value? I put it to you. So yes, and I think the model of government panels doesn't just reduce the potential for sort of cowboy operators, but can actually be doing a favour to the consumer, who's then like, great, I've got fewer choices, and actually that's going to make my life here a lot easier.
Okay. So Kathy, what about you?
I'm going to ask David a little bit more about his study, because I actually wouldn't mind having a look at some of the outcomes. Do you think that, I mean, we talked about obviously affordability, but also complexity, and people don't know what they're actually looking at and where they're coming from. What is the tougher one for your constituency, you think, at this point in time? Is it simply price and then complexity comes down, or is complexity causing the price issues too?
Well, we asked them about a number of. This is about over 600 businesses across Australia, by the way. Is the study we're talking about, and the one that we did with ECA recently. And we looked at 5 different areas. The advice they were getting, their attitude and agency towards net zero and new energy technologies, energy efficiencies in the retail market in general. And what came through, I mean, there's a lot in there, but I'll pick out one that I think really sits high. Is that more businesses than not see the value in a transition to net zero, which is quite interesting. And I think probably if you'd asked the question a couple of years ago, you might have got quite a different answer. So there is a shift in sentiment towards net zero being a good thing. But here's the really worrying thing: about 8 out of 10 businesses don't really know what it means and how they achieve it. And with apologies to the retailers out there in the room, the first people that people go to for advice is, of course, in the energy market is their retailer, right? Well, go figure. Of course, we say, who else would they ask? They wouldn't know, would they? So they ask the retailer, and that really isn't a place where that advice is there for them. So there's a paucity of consistent advice that can be given by retailers, and if you went up the line, of course, the generators and the like, without that roadmap that I spoke about earlier, that the whole country can get around, the advice is difficult to give. It really is. If you're, we've got King Carlos, the coffee maker here, and I've got some notes around him, and he's a coffee roaster, so he roasts over gas. But at the moment, does he invest in a new electrical cooker at the moment, or does he stay with gas? How would he know? How would I know? How would you know? Nobody knows. So I think the biggest challenge, in answer to your question, to businesses is the same one that we're discussing now, and it's the lack of certainty. And without certainty, there isn't investment in people or product development or the machines that we need to produce things, and that is really eating away at the confidence of Australian businesses at quite a deep level. Yeah.
All right, thank you all for really interesting questions for each other. I'm going to go through some of the audience questions now. And I wanted to start with thinking about what other sectors might be worth following. So Joel, you did mention in your talk water, and I think Paul's talk this morning raised some interesting models around energy as service, which come from other industries. So any other thoughts on other sectors where we see a good job being done around providing an essential service, but also maintaining that consumer trust? Did you want to expand a little bit first on your comments around water, Joel?
Well, I'm very mindful that I know very little about how the water system works, but I think that's sort of the point, I guess, is it works. As far as I'm concerned, as a water user, it works for me. I don't know how they got to that point, but they seem to have sorted it out. I was reflecting earlier, though, inside my own head, that when we had the Millennium Drought, which I remember being from South Australia, there was this real social norming of water restrictions, which seem to be pretty popularly accepted, and I wonder if part of that is that you can't really just go and generate more water so easily. But whenever someone suggests energy rationing, it's all the shock jocks are talking about how this is a crime against humanity. So I think that's an interesting point for me to maybe jump off on, is what is the difference out these two? Why are they sort of seen so differently as commodities? Is it to do with finitude? What is it? And how I think that energy rationing has this idea of people, heating baked beans with a match, which I think isn't the idea we're getting to, but I certainly think the idea that some people can probably afford not to, to cool their home to 25 degrees, and that's a good thing for our community, for those who can do it, is maybe something that could become more normalised.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I really remember that in WA growing up as well, the really rapid normalisation of you had your watering days, you had your days you didn't water, and consumers really seemed to just pick up on that and roll with it quite effectively.
but that said, I'm a big fan of energy abundance. So yes, there's a bit maybe attention there, but I think there's something to think about.
Okay, so we've got a very popular question here, which is for Kathy, and that is around which specific regulatory changes and reforms do you think are the most critical and the most urgent to ensure consumers are better off in the near future?
There's a lot.
A lot?
I'm not going to say one in particular. No, I will say one in particular, and I mean I alluded to communication before, but that's, you know, I think that's an outcome that we're never necessarily going to get. In terms of the regulatory reform, right now I think that it's a really basic one for me, and that's around access to the default market offer for embedded network customers. So I think people know what embedded network customers are. A lot of them are renters. A lot of them live in situations which are less affluent, I suppose is one description. And at the moment they don't have access to being able to have that safety net. And I think that's a really important and a really simple one as well, in terms of being able to do very quickly and simply.
Ruby, do you have anything? Oh, sorry, David, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add to a point that Joel mentioned in his speech about the passive cooling, because obviously in the Australian climate, go figure, it's useful to be cool because otherwise you might die. And design of particularly apartments in Australia has been very poorly controlled over the years, which means that we are actually driving the need to actively chill or cool spaces in a way that shouldn't be done if there was decent design. There's a great deal of work that's been done by Abby Galvin here in New South Wales as a state architect around apartment design for cooling across flows and mandating that. It actually failed, unfortunately, to get past the change of planning minister at the last time. But if you are interested in that, looking at the design and place guides, which were published last year by New South Wales government, covers a lot of those facts. And I think it's not just around provision of power at the affordable price. It's also about provision of decent housing that doesn't need so much power, right?
Ruby, I wonder if you've got anything to add on there in relation to your work in remote Australia.
On the point for Kerry, on the regulations,
or on any of
my
these,
choice.
yeah.
All right. So on the regulatory side of things, I try to stay pretty far away from what the network is doing on that side because I'm a technical person. So I let other people deal with that. But we're doing a lot of talking with the federal government and looking at ways that we can really just remove the barriers that are there already, I think, and create pathways. So like I said, we don't have any pathways for someone on a prepaid meter to have a solar system installed. We just helped the first guy in Australia on a prepaid meter to get solar installed. And the utility even came out and put a padlock on his installation until they were ready to let him have that. So we need to just create a pathway for that so that there's regulatory frameworks and there's frameworks within the utilities' way of doing things that people can have solar. Another big one for me is around the fossil fuel subsidies. So doing feasibility studies where I'm trying to make a case for solar, we know that it's a lot cheaper to generate power with solar or wind than it is with diesel, certainly. But there's fuel subsidies that are coming in that completely just turn that whole economic calculation on its head. So if we try to reduce the amount that Horizon Power is spending on creating their electricity, those benefits don't actually flow onto the communities because they are going to be subsidised for whatever that difference between what the user's paying and what their generation cost is. So that's been a particularly hard one for me to figure out how we get benefits to consumers when we've got these fuel subsidies that are just messing up the economics.
Right, so there's already been a lot of discussion around complexity and consumer awareness and a shared language. And, I started working in this space fairly recently and the acronyms really drove me mad for the first 6 months. I had to have a cheat sheet next to my computer. So this is possibly quite provocative question for all of you from John Gardner. And this is, does this call for education, is that just a form of shifting responsibility off the energy industry and onto end users? Users should be allowed to not care and to live decently. So does actually not knowing about your energy and being a passive consumer, is that maybe actually a right that needs protecting? David?
Shall I give it a go?
Yeah, give it a go.
I'll give it a go. Look, I think the being an uneducated buyer is always dangerous, whether you're buying a car, a house, or electricity. I think that it's pertinent for all people to be educated, and at least to a level that's appropriate. And not everybody needs to not everyone needs to be an electrical engineer like Ruby, but we do need to understand what people are selling us. And if we look at the data market and we look at the new technologies that are coming out and being sold to people, it's actually, there are all kinds of websites and chat shows and so on which inform people on which phone to buy, which data packages to buy. We've never had that with power, because it's been perhaps quite cheap in Australia and hasn't been something that we felt that we needed to. Nowadays, of course, retailers are not offering great deals either to swap packages. So you need to be educated in looking after yourself to the extent of lowering your usage, being more resilient, being more sustainable, particularly through this period ahead over the next few years when energy prices will undoubtedly continue to rise in some areas. So I don't think it's a transfer of responsibility or accountability. I think it's just sensible.
Joel, what do you think? Does Angus need to know more?
I think I quite like how Ruby put it, of like, you sort of want this like ignorance plus model where people can be ignorant and they can get by. The ones who want to exercise more choice have that option too. I think the question for me is, what is that floor and what does that experience at the bottom like? I think the analogy of buying a car is not perfect, but I would point out that like when you go and buy a car, like there are actually lots of legal protections in place. And if that car doesn't work, plenty of people might not have the resources to exercise their legal rights, but they do have those legal rights. And in some industries, we have like ombudsmen and people who can help people to access their legal rights. So I think maybe the automotive industry doesn't get this right either, but I still think if I do go and turn off buy a car knowing nothing about cars, what sort of experience should I have? And how can we look out for those people?
So I mentioned earlier that we, at the AER, we have a very small call centre compared to our friends at the Energy and Water Ombudsman. But we take 500 calls a month. 60% of them is around navigating the retail market. And so I semi-regularly listen to some of the recorded calls to understand what's actually happening and what people are wanting and what they're saying to our call centre. And I listened to one yesterday before coming, and it probably went for, I think I started at about 10 minutes and I think it finished at about 75 minutes. And it was from an older man. He probably was, just retired, very well educated, in a very, privileged position, and was trying to get off a demand tariff that he had been put on at some point in his life. And he did not know, and he had gone back and forward between retailers and networks and to us and around in circles trying to understand, what is this tariff I'm on? He didn't actually understand in the first place what a tariff was. Fair enough, why would you? And then what a demand tariff was, and then how to actually get it off, because it was, embedded in his meter through the network service provider. So it was one of those things that you kind of think, if someone in that situation doesn't understand how to get out of a situation that they find themselves, how is other people going to actually deal with that situation? And something similar, again, from a very privileged position. I'm moving into a new rental property, get the keys on Friday. It has a battery in it, it has solar panels in it. And so I went to the real estate agent and said, what's the battery, what is capacity and how many solar panels are on there, blah, 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 blah. And they said to me, we will not provide you with that information unless you come through our switching service and we will be able to provide you with that information to get the best deal for you. And I went, no, thank you. I run my own switching service, own service, and it's called Energy Made Easy, and you're not allowed to do that. I'm very sorry. They did change their tune very quickly, but again, I knew what my rights were, and I think that it just shows you that situations that people find themselves in are diverse, but it's because of the complex market in which we're actually operating and consuming electricity in.
Okay. All right, there's a fairly specific question here for Joel from Christy Walters. So Joel, you mentioned the carrot for landlords in terms of upgrading energy performance in their rental properties is not working. What's the stick?
Possibly repeating myself. Stick's a bit harsh, but I do think it is basically mandating the standard that that we want to see. Victoria has recently introduced requirements for fixed heaters in the main living area of rental properties. They call them energy efficient heaters. Some people dispute whether 2 stars meets that standard. ACT will have a ceiling insulation requirement rolling out from April. The UK they've got energy performance certificate minimum requirements for rental properties, and Aotearoa in New Zealand is doing the same. So this is like real models of how it can work. And I guess the stick is, what happens if they don't meet that standard? Maybe they can't rent it out. In New Zealand, there are fines if people get found non-compliant. I think that's probably what it looks like. We obviously don't want landlords to not rent them out. We want them to comply and keep the properties in the market, but make sure that people can live in them without getting sick.
Okay, so David, maybe carrot stick's not a perfect metaphor, but did you have any thoughts there on carrots and sticks in terms of the business community and energy efficiency?
Oh, look, I mean, I think there's, I think the message, if you will, around kind of carrots and other vegetables is that the business market needs to see carbon reduction, zero net zero emissions in future and so on as being something which is a driver of productivity, increased access to market, higher quality product, better brand positioning, and indeed, of course, lowered costs of production and therefore higher margin. I think if we drive down a very narrow stick path, which says, you've got to move, we'll probably drive people out of the marketplace. And again, back to that common terminology, and the common terminology needs to be about the outcomes, the better outcomes that the business can seek and achieve through energy transition, rather than it being about kind of using a stick on it, which I think would be entirely inappropriate at this time.
Okay. All right, we've got heaps of questions coming in. So Ruby, I might throw one to you, and this was around, if I can find it now, about whether the Indigenous community could build a community energy model for electricity supply. I might even expand that a little bit and ask you, what could the rest of Australia actually learn from what's happening in Indigenous communities and remote communities when it comes to potential community models or different ways of thinking about energy?
Yeah, so that's something that I'm exploring in my PhD at the moment, is what lessons might we take from a kind of traditional Indigenous society and the way that they shared resources. How might we apply that to the way that we look at energy systems? And so there's things like, built into our traditional stories are things like, no one person in the community should hold all of the knowledge about how to do a thing, like how to go from finding the fish, catching the fish, cooking the fish. No one should hold that, because that's a monopoly, and what we try to do in our energy systems is basically monopolize them. And we're always talking about vertical integration and how you can move more responsibility into a single company, and that really goes against what we had learnt through our 60,000+ years of living as a society. We decided that we needed to put rules against those sorts of things happening because it wasn't good for our societies. So I think there's things there. There's things about the energy sharing. You should, our energy systems should extend an extension cord out to your neighbour's house in some way, in whatever more sophisticated technological ways we have to do that. And we do have barriers on those types of things, that we can't share energy across property lines or whatever it is. So yeah, I think there's a lot that we could learn from Indigenous society, and we could restructure our energy systems. At least for our communities, we should be able to continue to live by our age-old traditions. And so right now we don't have the option to do that. So I'd love to see us eventually move towards Indigenous retailers and and gentailers and whatever else we need to do things in the way that we wanted to do them. I can't remember what the first part of the question is. Did I answer it at all?
No, that was absolutely perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. So I might kind of pick up a little bit on Ruby's point around sharing. So I just wondered if any of our other panellists, do you see that as part of the consumer energy future? More sharing, more collaboration, more people thinking about energy supply and usage as part of a community rather than as an individual household consumer?
I think there has to be a North Star, doesn't it? I think it has to be a guiding principle. It's almost dystopian that we're all in this room, and one of the richest energy continents on Earth with one of the smallest populations, wondering how we're going to provide power to our poorest neighbours. And it would be lovely to think that in future, when energy is widespread and free at the point of generation, that we don't need to have this conversation about how we provide energy as an essential resource to those who most need it.
Okay, so another comment.
Oh, can I make a comment?
Yeah, of course,
Sorry.
Kathy,
So
go
I think
for
that
it.
you can see it too, and I think, you know, things like community batteries and other initiatives are actually starting to permeate not only in the community and, you know, the sector that we operate and work in, but also, you know, politicians too. You know, most recently the Commonwealth Government have got their community battery program, and we're kind of supporting that process by, I don't want to get into technical stuff, but by ring fencing to ensure that they're, you know, it's not going to actually stifle competition or innovation, importantly. But the demand for community batteries as a result of going through this process is incredible. People want to know about what's going on. Can I be part of this program? Because people want to actively take control of their own situations, and they see it at a local level. And so we've been talking about community batteries for how long as a sector? Probably a decade. And it's kind of finally coming up. But again, how do you do it in an equitable way, I think is an important question. But in itself, by having a community battery, you are increasing, you know, you are increasing access to you know, renewables and cheaper electricity from people who haven't necessarily had it in the past, such as those who rent or who are in, you know, situations where they don't have roof space. So I think we may need to ensure that we actually have the right regulatory systems in place to make it flourish, rather than actually put it down. And we talked before a little bit about our regulatory sandboxing. So what's a sandbox? A sandbox is not something that I have in my office and I go and play and spit the dummy every now and again. I wish it was. But the regulatory sandbox it allows innovators to come to us and say, we want to do this, but under the rules, we don't think that we can at the moment, and the regulatory settings don't allow us. And so we do tests and we look at, you know, engaging with various people to ensure that there's minimal impact on consumers, and we go, okay, you've got your little piece of paper that says that you can go out and have a trial on a particular thing. So I think that those types of things are really important to get that innovation happening, particularly around ideas around community and accessing new ways of getting your electricity supplies in your own homes. I don't know if you wanted to make a comment, David.
I just sitting here enjoying a conversation. I think we talk about sustainability and resilience often in the same sentence. Just going back to what Ruby said around 60,000 years of proper usage of our resources here, we can learn from that. And the more that we network our local batteries, for example, microgridding and so on, and get away from major transmission routes and single sources of power, we will become much more resilient anyway, not only as a community but also as an economy. So from the business perspective, you know, the more that we diversify and bring it down to a local level and in that sharing manner which we're talking, it's not just about engineering, it's also about being sensible in the Australian context and being sensible in a world where there's, you know, a lot of change in the climate and in geopolitics. Let's be resilient.
Okay, so there's a question here which really is a spending question, but I think it links to what we've just been discussing, and that is, you know, when you think about the energy transition, the government is spending a lot on large infrastructure, electricity infrastructure in particular. Should there be more government spend on some of these issues that we're talking about, on helping consumers participate and engage and getting that direct consumer input into the transition? And what might that spending look like? David.
Well, I don't want to hog the conversation, but it has to be paid for one way or the other, and it'll either be paid for through tariffs, charges, and bills, or it gets charged through taxation. There are, you know, many different ways, of course, that this can be looked at, and I suppose the best way is that government starts spending, brings international and national players, particularly in the infrastructure financing world, to good solutions to be able to upgrade our energy systems in the way that we've spoken about, also being able to put pieces out in bite-sized chunks as we've just been talking about, and therefore keeping the spread of costs as low as possible over a sensible period of time, so that we don't just all wear it all in our bills in the first 5 years. I think there's an awful lot that needs to be debated around how we pay for this all. We know in New South Wales we've got an energy minister who's spending money on transmission lines in the hope to get focus here, to bring the big players, the big global players here to look at New South Wales and invest. It will need to be paid for. How we do it needs to be worked through urgently, and without harping on. We do really need to have that common conversation about what the roadmap looks like and what we need to spend and when.
Joel, do you have any thoughts there on investment and spending?
I wanted to add, I think lots of these measures are actually cost negative. I think we're right, David's right, that there's an upfront cost. I think the role for government is more about helping to amortise that cost and provide sort of financing the way that we finance infrastructure. And Saul Griffiths in Rewiring Australia speaks at this really well, conceptualising this as an infrastructure challenge and financing it the way we finance infrastructure. I think framing it just in terms like this will cost you money, and for businesses too, like huge benefits to be reaped here. So I think that's something that I think can be done. I think the sort of the question sort of about consumer input I think is challenging, because I'm a bit on the fence about that. I think a lot of consumers will have bad ideas, and like, is it worth the effort of trying to like teach everyone who's already exited the school system how these things all work? Again, the option should be there for people. I don't think we want to like treat citizens like patsies, but we can also just make the system work. And that does require consumer input, yes.
Yeah.
But what that input looks like and how it comes and the role of different advocates in helping it is perhaps more nuanced, and just like, let's have a whole bunch of focus groups.
Yeah. Can I just add to that? I think our view on consumers being educated is almost around the difficult times that are coming, because no matter how much we go at this really hard, there are difficult years ahead, and we absolutely need to carry the crew with us. And I think that's around that common language, common understanding, building trust in the journey, so that we don't have a backlash to some increased costs and lack of service and so on in the transition.
So Kathy, what about you to pick up on that from your point of view? What's a good way to get consumer input into the system?
Oh, by listening. I mean, I talked about this a little bit too. I mentioned before that we're looking at our engagement strategy in a different way than what we've done in the past. And I think what we've done in the past as an organisation is we've gone out, here's a very technical document, now you have to go and have it, and you've got 3 weeks to provide us with some advice around it. And I mentioned before Janine Rayner, who's here, who's had a career in the consumer sector over many years, is kind of coming into our organisation and going, that's not how you do it. You actually have to start listening rather than and asking rather than telling and closing. And so we're in the midst of kind of thinking about that, about what it means for us as an organisation, but not just in things like, what does the vulnerability strategy look like? Yeah, that's really important. But actually, what does effective communication and engagement from network service providers during a determination actually look like? And so it's that full range of, from the technical all the way through to, the more day-to-day stuff. So I think for us as an organisation, we need to listen more, and we need to think about how we actually engage appropriately to bring them into the conversation in an effective way. I mean, it's just like the ECA. We go to energy ministers' councils every 2 months, is it, Lynn? As stakeholders, and Lynn sits at the table and she makes sure that the ministers know what's going on from her point of view, and what her constituencies are telling her, and that transmission access reform is a big thing, and that Lynn bangs the table all the time. We need to do it for consumers. We need to do it from consumers. And so I think things like that too, that people have been more open to having people actually sit at the table rather than being consulted with outside the room.
Okay, so Ruby, I might ask you, because you're a technical specialist, but also engagement's very much heart and soul of what you do. So do you have any thoughts there around innovations and engagement, how to do it better?
For me, I think it's just bringing the two together is a good start. There's not that many people that are crossing over in that space, so I call myself a bit of a hybrid model of engineer. So I go to some conferences, like the one I went to 2 weeks ago, and it was just, a room full of social scientists talking in this space. And then I might go to another conference and it's just so technology focused and heavy, and there's all engineers sitting in the room, and I just don't feel like we're having enough crossover between those groups. And often engineers think that they don't have to care about the end user because it's just about the technology and the algorithms and getting that part right. And I experienced that recently with my original PhD supervisors. I was in the electrical engineering department, and I had to leave because they couldn't understand why the user was important to consider. And they said things like, why do you have to go to communities to help them? Just write an algorithm, it'll help everybody. And, I said, well, I have to go and look at the systems and talk to the people and understand how they use it. And can't you use the remote data? They don't have any remote data, they don't have internet. Can't you video call them? And I think, okay, you guys don't understand what we're dealing with. So, bringing that together, shake the engineers and be like, you need to talk to these real people and stop designing in that silo that we were talking about where you're just bouncing around ideas about technology. I'm sorry about this side of the room, I'm not ignoring you. Someone put my chair this way and my mic this way, so apologies there.
So shaking a few engineers.
Yeah,
good plan. Okay, we need to sort of wrap up in about 10 minutes. So I think because of this focus that's really been set since the beginning of the day about the human at the centre of the energy system, we've talked a lot about diverse consumer experiences in this panel today. And some of you really did give some incredible insights into real consumer experiences in your talks. But I wanted to just go back and get each member of the panel to maybe give us another bit of a lived experience insight. So someone you've spoken to, consumer that you've engaged with, who had a particular experience that you think it really resonated with you or it exemplifies one of the challenges that we've talked about today. So David, because you're closest, I'll start with you.
Yeah, look, the ones that I think about most are those hard-working smart manufacturing businesses that we have here in Australia who are really struggling in a marketplace where other people are buying our gas and providing it to their pipelines cheaper than we can buy it here, and effectively putting their product on the back of those ships as those ships sail out across the sea. And they are really struggling for a sense of struggling with a sense of helplessness. They're hearing governments talking about repatriating essential sovereign manufacturing to Australia. They hear people talking about building more lithium batteries here and leading the world in green technologies. But the world is against them when they see their gas bills going up by 4 or 5 times in the short term. So I'm thinking about foundries here in Sydney, very, very smart, top end of technology kind of foundries. I'm thinking about railway manufacturers in South Australia who are really struggling with their products being shipped off to coal-powered factories in India and so on. So I think that's where it really bites home with us at the moment. It's the real loss of real jobs, it's the real loss of real skills, but it's the loss of mojo, it's the loss of that drive to keep Australia at the front of the world in making really smart products. And I think that's the kind of focus that we have on our customers, the ones that are really doing it hard. And they're glass manufacturers, they're making aluminium and they're making biscuits and all kinds of things, but it really is in those energy intensive part of the marketplace where we can't just say, well, we're not going to make these things because they are essential to our economy. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So Joel, how about you? Particular consumer experience that, as David said, really bites home for you?
One does come to mind. So we've doing this project called Renter Researchers. We're doing it for the 3rd time this summer. We did it last winter and last summer, and we get 50 to 70 renters across the country, send them temperature trackers to track the temperature and humidity in their homes. But really engage with them. They're part of a WhatsApp group. We run a couple of surveys, we do phone interviews, and get a pretty rich picture of the challenges people are facing. And the survey results are hard stuff to read. Like, you sort of need to, pace yourself, have a cup of coffee, because people are, particularly with the energy price rises we've seen, dealing with some real scarcity. And I think there's a survey response I remember from last winter of a mother describing like having panic attacks when she could hear her children having a long shower because of her worry about what that would cost on her bill. And I think the same person spoke about sort of cutting a chicken breast 4 ways to make the meal feed her family. And I think that is not just caused by the way the energy system is working. There's obviously an intersection here of a lot of different things. But I think it really highlights for me like some of the challenges that we are trying to face and looking for what things we can do to improve something for someone in that situation. We, I guess, at Better Renting, like as a starting point, let's try to make sure that person can have a livable home and that they don't have to worry about what it will cost them to keep their home healthy in winter. But yeah, I often think about that, and it certainly makes me quite motivated to keep up the work we do.
Fantastic.
So for me, we talked about it before, which is our Towards Energy Equity Vulnerability Strategy for Consumers, and in it we did a lived experience panel session, and so we included quotes from all of the lived experience panellists about their experiences of vulnerability and energy use. And I think it really hit home for a lot of the team that had been working on a vulnerability strategy for 12 months. And talking about vulnerability, the word, it's a word, and you put it over here. But until you actually see what people are going through that lived experience panel, I think it really affected the team in a really deep way. Which was appropriate for public servants to kind of actually put yourself in people's shoes about what they experience. And so if you do have an opportunity, have a look at our Towards Energy Equity program, strategy, and you can see every comment in there is actually from an individual experiencing energy vulnerability, and it's quite something to think about, I think is the right description for me anyway.
And there's the video as well, actually, isn't there, Kathy, on the AR site, which is actually quite powerful.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, Ruby, final one from you.
I think I spoke about a lot of different consumers that I've talked to, and it's very similar stories to what Joel just shared. I think what's been interesting for me, though, is I also bought a house recently, and it doesn't have any insulation, and it's in Rockhampton, and it's very hot right now, and we don't have air conditioners that work. And so we've gone through this summer of just being incredibly hot, and I work from home, and it's been, like an awful experience, but at the same time, I'm like really grateful for having it, because I'm like, oh, okay, now I understand a lot better what people are dealing with. We can't cool the house down at night time is a big problem, so you don't sleep well. And the fridge, your fridge doesn't work very well if it's really hot inside, we've noticed, and so our fridge has actually like started malfunctioning to the point where it's like I can't keep the temperature at the temperature you told me to, so I have to move into another function. We've had to like move it off the wall so that it can get better ventilation, so that's been really interesting. And yeah, just experiencing what it's like to try and get this heat out of the house has been incredible. The food in the pantry is also going bad. I've got pretty high spirits about it because it's like a learning experience for me. But yeah, it's really shocking though, and this is like what people have to deal with a lot in Northern Australia. It's just hot, and if your house is poorly made, then you don't have other options. I'm going to do these things and get air conditioning and all that sort of stuff. I'm working on it, but a lot of people don't have that option, and this is what they have to deal with every single year. So I'm very grateful that I only have to live with it for one summer, hopefully. But yeah, it's been a good experience to know what the hardships that a lot of people that I'm working with go through.
Thank you so much for that. It is pretty much time to wrap it up and head to lunch. I'd really like to thank everybody in the audience for your engagement. There were some fantastic questions that have come through which we didn't get to, but we can continue that over lunch. Let's finish by giving another big thank you to Kathy, Joel, Ruby and David for such a thought-provoking discussion.